We're on week 2 of our Bible reading in the book of Second Timothy, our last book for 2023, as we conclude our trip through the letters of Paul this year. Talked a little bit just in general about the letter itself last time, and we urged you guys, when you spend some time reading it this week, to be thinking about, what's he doing with the letter? What's the big idea? And I want to talk to you a little bit about that today, and maybe that'll give you a basis to go back and do a reread, and maybe think about some of the things at least we'll offer to you today as possibilities. But I can't define the purpose of this letter without thinking about the situation that Paul is in,
Right.
And who he's writing to. So on the one hand, you have a Paul who, as we said last week, clearly senses the end is coming.
Right.
He isn't on the traditional deathbed as we think about
Right.
it. But
This is going to be a natural death he's facing.
yeah, but it's like that. He knows
the end is here.
The end is near, and he has been this great laborer in the gospel. In a sense, he's kind of passing the torch to a younger generation, Timothy being one of those guys. And so this letter seems to me to be sort of like that last speech, like some professors in college give a last
lecture,
or a dying father might call his son to his bedside and give him some final admonitions. As far as what the letter is about, I think that's the big idea.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Older gospel preacher facing his end, kind of handing off to this younger guy who will carry on the work.
And what's interesting about that, David, too, is when you realize that's the essential dynamic going on here. So then you look at the actual content of what is said, if that's what's going on. It's fascinating that Paul is basically going to die the way he lived, which is he's just obsessed with the gospel and that the work goes on. It's not about him in a sense. I mean, he admits he's ready to get his reward, but it's just about, Timothy's spiritual well-being, and that Timothy is able to well carry on the work that Paul spent his life doing. So even in death, Paul's not so much worried about who gets the house and who gets the cars, and he's not leaving much of an earthly estate by. What matters to him is what matters in life, that the work of the gospel goes on well and is in capable hands. And so virtually everything he says in this letter, by and large, is about that. And that's, I think, something that's worth thinking about in terms of our own lives when our end comes, if we are able to leave this world in a way in which we have some awareness that our end is coming, as opposed to, dropping dead of a heart attack or something. What would you say? Would you be able to focus so much on kingdom things like this versus your larger concerns would be, more of an earthly nature?
Yeah, and to me, when you understand that dynamic going in, the letter really does make sense because 2 Timothy is just filled, I think you called them, with imperatives. These
verbs of this is what you need to do.
Yeah, over and over and over again. So early in the letter, he gets to that right away. Kindle afresh the gift of God that is in you. Do not be ashamed. Retain the standard of sound words. Guard the treasure. Beginning of verse 2. Be strong. The whole letter is loaded with those kinds of statements over and over again. And I don't know, when I read it, I can almost hear this older brother and I guess the firmness in his voice when he says these things. Because it's of great concern to him that Timothy continue to do this.
Right. Well, because at the end of the day, this gospel message is where real life and death hang in the balance. Everything else about what we consider to be daily life is just water under the bridge when all is said and done. Because it is interesting. I mean, literally, he uses those kind of words in chapter 4. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom. I mean, that verse right there, that's ultimate reality. And I think, whether you're an apostle or whether, you're a preacher or whether you're just, somebody's trying to make their way through daily life with a secular job, at the end of the day, that's what it all comes down to in the end.
Yeah.
And Paul is calling us all back to, part of living well is being prepared to die. in light of those are the final realities.
Yeah, you kind of hear the drama in his
Yeah.
voice
Yeah.
when he talks about this, his emphasis, his concern on these things. It's probably worth identifying what some of those concerns are. So just a question as an aside.
Yeah.
Sometimes people read First Timothy and Second Timothy, and they kind of feel like Timothy may had a lean towards timidity,
Yeah.
that maybe he wasn't always as bold as he ought to be. Do you think that's fair? Are we reading too much into the language there?
Well, I think in Second Timothy in particular, the verse that a lot of people jump to rapidly is chapter 1, verse 7 for that idea, right? Where Paul has to, for this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you, which implies that it must not be currently fanned into flame. And then reminding him in verse 7, for God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. And so, yeah, I mean, there is kind of a history of people reading those words. And part of what Paul was trying to do to Timothy before he dies is kind of light the fire again. Not so much that Timothy was falling away, but that perhaps, and again, think about it, your mentor is facing execution for doing what you're doing.
And others have abandoned him.
Yes, and others have abandoned him. And of course, I mean, certainly, others, this wouldn't be the first time Timothy would have seen persecution. Part of the problem is, there's other indications that Timothy has suffered persecution well himself over the course of his ministry. So why now would Timothy necessarily be? And so it may just be more, not so much that it's certainly possible that Timothy had a timidity about him, which is almost kind of a fun way of saying that. But it's also possible that just in the same way, if you or I were to encourage each other, especially if one of us was dying, and you one of the other of us was to say to each other, kindle afresh the flame. It's not that you hadn't, but it's just, listen, man.
Yeah.
Stay motivated, or even don't be discouraged at my passing.
Right.
There are some other possible ways to, because even those of us who aren't, it may not be a fear factor thing. It's just you get tired, you get worn out, you get discouraged doing the work over time, especially when a mentor or somebody close to you passes.
Yeah. I've wondered if maybe we were too hard on him,
Yeah.
and maybe read more there
Yeah.
than was intended.
It's not impossible, but it's not the only way to read it.
What preacher doesn't need to be told, hey, stir the fire?
Yeah, that's right.
Everyone goes through seasons of discouragement and disappointment. Every disciple goes
Just
through
tiredness. We're
seasons.
exhausted.
Yeah,
just
and
worn out.
So keep that fire burning.
Yeah.
Keep it hot all the
Yeah.
time. So I wondered about that. It's also interesting to me to pay attention to the kinds of things he chooses to say. If we're right about sort of the setting and what Paul is trying to do, his points of emphasis, I think, are particularly interesting.
Yeah.
He is concerned about truth, and that's illustrated in chapter 1 as well as anywhere else in the letter,
Right.
where you have that sort of side-by-side statement in chapter 1 and verse 13, and then in verse 14, guard, or rather retain the standard of sound words, and then guard the treasure that has been entrusted to you, which seems to me both to be speaking to continuing in the truth that you have had revealed to you, and don't let anything corrupt that.
Well, that's right. And that's been a strong theme throughout all these pastoral letters.
Yeah.
It was in First Timothy, it was in Titus. In these personal letters to preachers, Paul has emphasized to preachers in particular. But I mean, it's really legitimate for any Christian. There is truth, there is error, there is true teaching, there is false teaching, and so part of all of our jobs, but especially those who preach the word, is to protect and stay within what the Spirit has revealed through the apostles. And so, even there, the book both begins and ends. You're mentioning that language about the deposit or
Right.
whatnot. But chapter 1 and verse 13 and 14 follow the pattern of sound words that you have heard from me. So again, if there is a pattern or a standard, depending on your translation, of
Right.
sound words, what that implies is there are words that are not sound that a preacher can speak. There are limits to what is truly, what can truly be said in the name of God and Jesus.
Yeah, and let's be clear, when we talk about words that aren't sound, what that means is they're not true.
That's right.
They're not consistent with the gospel. So really you get down to something that is fundamental to a disciple's worldview, and that there is a God who gave a standard and either this agrees with it and it's true, or it's in conflict with it and it's false. So
Right.
from a biblical perspective, there is absolute truth, there is absolute error, and it's vital that disciples be able to distinguish between the two. In fact, he does get to that at the end of the letter too, right?
Mhm.
With the warning about people who want to have their ears tickled, and they'll find someone
Right.
who will tell them what they want to hear. And so that idea seems to me to be running throughout the letter, his concern with that you continue
Right.
to abide in the truth, which is a important message for us to hear as well. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that he addresses dangers, enemies of that
yeah.
truth. So you have in chapter 3 culture.
Right.
That's one of the New Testament examples where we have
Right.
that ugly
This
list.
last days culture, as he describes it.
Exactly. And then false brethren.
Yeah.
So another interesting thing in this letter is he actually, at a couple of different levels, addresses brethren who aren't abiding in the truth, brethren who were not going to stand up in the face of persecution and would wilt and run away. And,
Right.
And in fact, that I think that is part of the reason that he wants Timothy to come to him, is he's had some folks abandon him, and I
Right.
think it is really
Right.
feeling the pain of that absence. And so you've got two problems out there. You got the problem of the culture in the world, and the problem with brethren who will not stand up for what is true.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And again, so it's serious business. I think it's fascinating to your point, especially about people who won't endure sound teaching in these latter days, but will turn aside to teachers who will, as he puts it there in chapter 4, verse 3, they have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, who basically tell them what they want to hear. And so it's a warning on both sides. It's a warning to those of us who teach, but it's also a warning to, everybody else to be careful what you want to hear, because God will, once it's God will let you have it, just won't be the truth.
Yeah. So think about that big idea, the letter of an older preacher as he is about to die to a young co-worker with him who will carry on after he's gone. And it start looking for these admonitions. One thing I did in my Bible, you may want to do it in your Bible, is just go through and mark every place where you have this kind of imperative: retain the standard of
Or
sound
even make a
word.
list on a piece of paper.
Guard the guard the treasure. And notice how many of those relate to the things that we're talking about, whether it is sticking with the words of truth, or resisting those who would corrupt it, or being willing to suffer for the cause. That idea runs a lot through the letter. And when we get together next week, we'll make some applications of all of that as we continue working our way through this important letter.